So before I start, oh wait, this is very, oh, sorry. On that. Sorry, this is, okay, cool. All right, so before we start, I want to acknowledge that we are seated in the traditional, ancestral, and ceded territory of the Musqueam people. Now, these are not just words; these have to be actions. So for me, I'm making 3 trips in the next week. So before I go to every place, I actually look up the history and the original caretakers of the land, and I do the acknowledgement as I land usually. So that's how I translate those acknowledgements into my own actions. And I encourage you to do the same as you travel for the summer. So today, I'm very happy to introduce Rumi Naito as the first speaker. Rumi is a 5th-year PhD student. She's just a few weeks away from completing her dissertation. Woo! Congratulations. And today she's going to be presenting her last chapter of her thesis. And she's currently writing this up for submission and also for her thesis. So any feedback is highly appreciated as Rumi gets this ready for public consumption. This chapter is, in my opinion, also the most exciting chapter of her entire PhD dissertation. Rumi evaluates how conservation messaging influences exotic pet trade actions across different segments. So over to you, Rumi.
Thank you. How do I do this? Sorry, where do I put this? Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for coming to my talk. So the title of the presentation is Evaluating the Impact of Conservation Messaging on Exotic Pet Trade Across Diverse Audience Segments. These are my co-authors. Kai and Jain are my co-supervisors. So just quickly, as we all know, we are facing massive climate and ecological crisis, largely caused by human activities. And to address those environmental challenges, we need a fundamental shift in both human behaviors and the social systems. But in this study, we are focusing on human behavior aspect. The current research gap. Many past research, a lot of past research have investigated effective strategies to change human behaviors, but most interventions tackling environmental problems have only examined average effects across populations, while overlooking individual differences and then how they respond to interventions within a given population. Also, there have been many studies exploring people's different reasons for pro-environmental actions and inactions, but again, the heterogeneity of such reasons have been underexplored. And then as such, most environmental campaigns tend to rely on one-size-fits-all approaches across diverse populations. But uniform interventions will not work for everyone. So how can we get everyone to act toward environmental sustainability? That's the basic inspiration of this research. So this study develops a novel audience segmentation approach to test the impact of conservation messaging, and also to explore different patterns of reasons for action and inaction across diverse population. We used the exotic pet trade as a focal case. Just a quick review of the exotic pet trade. It is a large contributor to biodiversity loss and ecological crisis worldwide. about 20% of the global wildlife trade is driven by the demand for exotic pets. And United States is the top importer of exotic pets globally. So this makes it, so engaging with the US public in demand reduction and also civic action is key to combat it. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about the method, but we started with a pilot study to understand, to test our methods, but also to explore our participants' characteristics. And the current study, we had almost 3,000 participants in the survey. We used a mixed method with pre-registered quantitative analysis and exploratory qualitative analysis. The data collection was all done on online survey via Amazon Mechanical Turk. Sample size, so we needed this large number of samples because we needed minimum 241 participants per segment. And we segmented participants based on their levels of commitment to wildlife conservation. So that's how we approached to the segmentation of audience. But also we applied, those participants' levels of commitment to wildlife conservation to the diffusion of innovation theory or framework. For those who are not familiar with diffusion of innovation theory, it is an influential framework for audience segmentation. And it's been used widely to explore how new norms, ideas, and the patterns of behaviors are spread across societies through distinct subsets of the population. So typically initiated by innovators or change makers, new ideas and behaviors spread from early adopters to early majority and to late majority and finally to laggards if the diffusion is successful. But I should mention that this study doesn't have the temporal aspect as this figure shows. So we are not studying behavior diffusion in this study, but we are exploring the implication of it as we think about transformative change. So in the audience segmentation, for early adopters were those who selected, I am the voice for wildlife. Early majority are those who selected, I strongly support societal action to protect wildlife. And late majority are those who selected, I am willing to support societal action to protect wildlife. And laggards are, I am indifferent or don't support societal action to protect wildlife. So this is a continuum scale of 4 options. And then we designed the messaging conditions. So we wrote the narratives, but I worked with a local visual science communicator, Alana McPherson from Emily Carr University. And she helped us put our narratives into this beautiful image. So this is message 1, highlighting negative consequences of the exotic pet trade. You're not going to be able to read the text, but our narratives were presented in a comic style story. And this is message 2, highlighting the power of collective action for system change. And then this is message 3, that is a control condition featuring exotic animals as used in arts. And and then one of 3 messages were randomly assigned to participants. And we had total 7 measures, but the 4 measures were to test to understand people's intentions, behavior intentions. So the first question was to measure how likely they are to avoid wildlife entertainment visitation. And I started the survey by asking people to imagine that a new exotic cafe or roadside zoo opened up in their neighborhood, and then asked if they would check it out or avoid it. And then I had a following question to measure people's intended civic action, which include petition signing, petition sharing, and protesting, and also measured in 7-point Likert scale. In addition to that, I also measured 3 actual click-through actions. So using a real current online campaign organized by World Animal Protection, we invited participants to take action. And then if participants clicked yes, then they were directed to the campaign website. If they selected no, then they would just proceed to the next question. We did the same with share the petition widely and also volunteer to protest. So these were our measures. And then finally, we asked one open-ended question to explore reasons for action and inaction across segments. Why would you or would you not take any actions to protect wildlife? That was the question. And the answers were coded and categorized into reasons for action or inaction per segment. It's a typo, it's not sentiment, per segment. And then voluntary question, it was a voluntary question with a response rate of 57%. So we had a fairly large sample size for the qualitative coding. Almost 1,700 participants gave us responses. And this is, this is the result, but demographics by segment. And out of 2,953 participants, we had about 8% for early adopters, 37% for the early majority, 40% for the late majority, and 15% for laggers. So I would say this was roughly a normal distribution. And this is so we have 3 main results, but this is one of the first set of results, and messaging effects on behavior intention. Oh, how do I cannot. Oh, thank you. Okay. Yeah, so messaging effects of behavior intentions. So I want you to look at the first one, A, the figure A, and then what is, hang on. Okay, now it's, okay. Yeah, and then what it shows is that, so message 1, highlighting the negative consequences of the exotic pet trade, and the message 2, the collective action message. Those were significantly more effective than the control message for motivating people to avoid wildlife entertainment, and their effect dependent on the segment. As you can see, it had significant, both messages had significant impact on early majority, late majority, and the laggers to avoid wildlife entertainment, but it didn't have any meaningful impact on early adopters, which is kind of intuitive because early adopters may be the type of people who do not need to be convinced by messaging. But then also what's encouraging is that messaging did influence even the last to change audience, which is the group of laggers. Like previous studies have found that laggers tend to be the most challenging type of people who to engage through messaging. But then our our experiment proved that there is a possibility to also engage with others with messaging in terms of this type of private action. And then if you look at figure B, C, and D, those are the civic actions. So here you can see that the contrast is not as apparent as we saw in figure A, but what this means is that message 1 and particularly message 2 were slightly more effective than the control message for promoting civic intention, but there was no interaction effect between the two. So the effect, those messaging effects did not depend on segments. And that's one of the results. And then second result is messaging effect on click-through action. We found that both conservation messages motivated the early adopters to sign a petition compared to the control message. And also, only message 2, the collective action message, motivated the early majority to sign a petition. So just to summarize, collective action message was the only type of message that was able to engage with both early adopters and early majority to sign a petition. There's a lot to unpack here, so I'm not going to go through everything, but we believe that positive framing, the message presented in message 2, likely reinforce the perception of petition signing as valuable contributions to social change, particularly among those two segments. And then finally, this is a result for the qualitative analysis. And I know there's a lot going on here, but what I want to highlight here is that the green bars represent reasons for action, and then yellow bars represent reasons for inaction. And what you can see here is that each segment has quite different reasons for action or inaction. And particularly early adopters and laggers tend to have pretty opposite outcomes in their response to that qualitative question. And one of the things that was really striking was that the care, the notion of care appeared in every segment, and but then it had different meanings depending on which segment they were. So for early adopters and early majority, a lot of them mentioned that they care about animals and then they shouldn't be kept in captivity for wildlife entertainment. But many late majority and then a lot of laggers actually mentioned care as their reason for inaction, meaning like it's their reason not to support conservation actions, because they believe that wildlife entertainment venues provide the shelter and the care that wild animals need. And without those places, animals can go extinct. And that was a lot of people mentioned that type of reason for not supporting conservation actions. So that was really interesting to see. And also what I want to highlight here is that early majority and the late majority tend to think that ease and convenience is a very important reason for them to take action. And then early adopters and then laggers tend to have different sets of values, like early adopters thinking that conservation and wildlife protection is really important for ecosystems, that type of environmental value-based beliefs, but laggers tend to think that humans have we have better things to take care of in a society. Also, care in their own view. And just wrap up potential intervention in future research. So for future intervention, for early adopters and early majority, we suggest that interventions might help them amplify their values, and actions, and then also use positively framed messages to increase the sense of empowerment in taking action among those individuals. So for example, use social networks to help them reach like-minded others or build a sense of community. And for early and late majority, make it easy to participate in conservation actions. So simplifying the navigation of campaign website, also provide instant feedback, and then maybe provide incentives too might be motivate those groups of people more. And for laggards, use value-based messages tailored to their worldview and include them in conservation education. So for example, like interventions could try to appeal to their emotions and notion of care, use social networks to get the messages to them, and engage with them at public spaces like zoos and aquariums and other leisure destinations. But in general, we need more effective strategies to engage people in civic action. And that's an area opportunity for future research. Conclusion, this study highlights the potential of segmented approaches for amplifying conservation efforts to reduce demand for the exotic pet trade, and also to increase public support for system change. Our findings have broader implications beyond wildlife conservation, particularly in addressing climate change and the plastic pollution, because those environmental issues require a lot of people to change their behaviors and take more civic actions. So our segmented approaches would be helpful in addressing many types of environmental issues. And by targeting interventions to specific segments of the population, we might be able to reach and motivate more individuals to take action for sustainable future. So that's my presentation. And I just want to finish it with acknowledgement. These organizations and individuals for helping me and work. So thank you. Yeah, so how did I code qualitative questions? Yeah, so me and then the third author, Lucio, we worked together to code all the responses. We did it in the iteration, we did it 3 times using Excel spreadsheet. So basically what we did is first we read every single response and then extracted themes based on all the individual responses, and then we came up with 24 themes of code, and then we went back to each response and then started assigning each response to one of those, but not necessarily one, but each response to 24 codes. And then some participants had comments that included multiple codes, and in that case we assigned several codes. Then we came up with a pretty big list of codes, and then we compared. So Lucio and I worked independently, and then we met, and then we compared our results, our coding results, and then wherever we didn't agree, we discussed, and then we solved one by one, and then we finally came up with a set of codes. So it was a great. Oh, yeah, should I open the slide? So how did I come up with the phrases for audience segmentation? Well, I referred to a few existing studies, and it was in the wildlife context, but it was a climate change segmentation study. And so I adapted their wording. So, yeah. But the point is that like these segments needed to be in the continuum. Okay. Why is that? So the question is, if the segmentation approach would be important for qualitative. What about why? What is your result? Why? Oh, so why did I come up with that conclusion? Like, yeah. So, well, first of all, yeah. So a lot of my conclusion actually, you're right, like came from our qualitative results, but also the messaging approach that I mentioned is that so when we design composition messages, then let me just think. Okay. Yeah. So let me think a second. So yeah, so this result is important for designing future messages because it shows that, well, first of all, like a lot of studies have mentioned that conservation messages are not really applicable to certain types of like class to change type of audience. So like in this case, bloggers. And then it is true. A lot of studies have said that those groups of people need more like a structural, like policy or regulatory approach to change the behaviors. But then our studies show that at least in the context of wildlife entertainment visitation, there's so much potential for conservation messages to engage with this last group of population as well. So yeah, and then also message 2, collective action message is generally slightly more effective to motivate people to take civic action. And it means that like the positively framed message might be a way to go to engage more widely, even though we didn't find that it's the segment effect, but still, like in general, on average, we had a really, yeah, we had a substantial effect of the satisfaction method. Thank you.
It's just, I think it slid down.
Oh, that's why. They said it was great. In the
Oh,
beginning.
yeah. Thanks for
Oh,
that.
you didn't hear?
Yeah, Zoom's, they could hear, but Zoom, here. So you can just talk into that and then pass it on to John.
Okay, so we'll move on to the second speaker here. My name is Naito Ellis, and I'm the committee member for the second speaker, Josh Travers. I am here in place of, or your supervisor, Gunilla over. And let's see here. You're in your second year of your master's. He comes from completing his first degree at Queen's University in the area of global development with a minor in environmental studies. You've been sort of critically analyzing some of the environmental burden of resource extraction in terms of so-called developing countries and how it shows up in developed countries. And here at UBC, he's been engaged with circular economy of plastics and its social and environmental impacts. You're a member of EGESTA, as well as UBC Microplastics Cluster, and has completed 2 sustainability internships. And with that, I welcome you to the stage.
Thanks so much. How's the sound there? Good? Good on Zoom as well? Sweet. Thank you, Naoko, for that introduction. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks, Rumi, for getting us started. I'm going to give you a presentation today on my master's thesis research so far. This is a work in progress, so as much as anything, it's a progress report, but there are some interesting parts to share so far. So I'll dive in. My project is, the working title is The Circular Economy for Plastics, Social and Environmental Implications of a Nebulous Idea. Today, I'm going to give you a background on the circular economy and my focus on plastics. And I'm going to dive into the study, my design, my methods, and what I hope to achieve with this study. And then I'm going to give you some preliminary findings. I think this is the most interesting part of the presentation. And I'm going to share some data from early analyses that I've recently undertaken. So to start, what is the circular economy? It's easiest to explain it in relation to the linear economy, but briefly to start, it's being shared as a kind of a hot topic issue. Many governments, businesses, industry are all talking about it. It's in the public realm to a certain extent. What we have right now is a linear economy. And if you look on the left side of the screen there, you see a large, thick blue arrow coming in. So lots of resources coming into the system. We use those resources in goods and services, and then we expel a lot of resources as well, disposal and incineration at the bottom. And you see some loops maintained in the system. What's being talked about is a transition to a circular economy. And many jurisdictions are putting that forward as a sustainable strategy. And the main thing, to summarize it in a brief sentence, is that everything remains in the system. 100% of resources that go into the system remain in the system. And in order to do that, we design with the end in mind. We typically shift to more modular and lease-based ownership systems, and we achieve very high recovery rates. And if you look at the diagram all the way on the right side, you see a small amount of resources coming into the system, still used, small amount leaving, and lots staying in circulation. In Canada right now, under our linear system, we recycle about 9% of plastics. We incinerate about 4%. We have about 1% being released directly to the environment, and then the other 86% goes to landfill. And the idea of the circular economy is that we could shrink all of those numbers to 0, except for 100% retention. And there are many proponents of the circular economy. It's a very popular sustainability strategy. The Government of Canada, amongst other governments, have used it. And one example there is the zero plastic waste agenda and plan, relies very heavily on the circular economy idea. There are also many brands who put forward. Apple and IKEA are good examples. IKEA has actually released a public statement saying that they will be 100% circular by 2030. And there are many industry associations who have also relied heavily on circular economy in their messaging, such as the Chemistry Industry Association of Canada. So shifting now a little bit to my other focus, which is plastics. And I'm sure most of us have heard these all before, but I'll briefly go through them, that there are many problems with plastics, even though they're so ubiquitous and so widely used for many useful things. One of which is breakdown. Plastics inevitably degrade in the environment. They create microplastics and nanoplastics, and they enter organisms and various food webs. They're also very persistent once they enter the environment. Once they're there, they're very difficult to remove, and they can take hundreds of years or longer to degrade if they degrade at all. And there are also many health impacts. We know that macroplastics, large plastics, impact organisms, animals, typically causing death if they're ingested. We also know that micro and nanoplastics are produced, and it seems likely that they cause health issues in humans, but the research is not concluded on that, and more is being carried out. So there is a circular economy approach that has been talked about specifically for plastics and has three main parts. The first of which is to eliminate waste, and that's done through design. So we don't want to design plastics in a way which allows for reuse and more efficient recycling. And then from there, we want to maintain the value of resources, keep individual plastics in circulation for as long as possible. When they can no longer be recirculated, break them down into raw components for remanufacturing. And then the third part is to regenerate nature. We want to move away from extractive practices that underpin plastic production and to more sustainable, reusable materials away from oil, ideally. And this comes from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. But the circular economy is not without critique. According to Korhonen et al., there are many conflicting definitions of a circular economy, and a lot of it goes down to what individual actors can feasibly achieve or what they're focused on. This, unsurprisingly, leaves the door open to greenwashing and other problematic environmental messaging. Some academics, such as Ma, are very critical of the circular economy because of the influence of industry. As Ma states, the circular economy is a tool for industry to future-proof capitalism and ensure long-term profitability. And then there are also some technological issues. The technical requirements have not been met, and for some of the versions of a circular economy that have been talked about that require very little behavior or social change, social change. And then there are other academics that say we're very overly optimistic about future technology and what happens if we don't see those technological advances that we speak of or hope for. Another thing that I think is very important to highlight is that there are health impacts specifically associated with the circular economy for plastics that have not been, potentially don't show up with other materials, at least in the same way. Several studies have analyzed items containing recycled plastics and have found endocrine disruptors, which are not approved for use in these products. Endocrine disruptors can cause birth defects, increased risks of cancers, hormonal issues, among other health impacts. And it's really important to consider this in relation to a circular economy for plastics, because it's incredibly unlikely that we will have 100% collection rates, whether it's because of the laws of thermodynamics and knowing that plastics will degrade and need to be replaced by virgin inputs, or because logistical challenges of collecting plastics, especially the way they're used now with so many consumer goods. How do you ensure that 100% of those are collected? With all that said, my study has three main aims. The first one is to understand how plastic managers identify opportunities and problems related to a circular economy for plastics. The second is to understand what risks are plastic managers actually focused on, who identifies which risks and how do they play out in the public realm. And then the third one is related to conceptualization of the circular economy and different consequences. Which framing does the thinking of plastic managers fall into? And then what are the related social and environmental implications of those framings? To do so, I'm relying heavily on a framework from Callisto Friant et al. And they created a four-part typology that categorizes conceptualizations and discourse around a circular economy. I'm using that framework because it was the most broadly applicable framework that I could find. And it's also simple enough that I can allow codes and different things to arise that do not necessarily fit into that and see how the data presents itself to me, both inductively and deductively. It provides insight into how technological and social issues are likely to be considered or not, depending on the dominant framing. And then it's also, for me, very useful for describing the current conversations around a circular economy for plastics. This briefly is a very simplified version of that framework from Callisto Friant et al. On the left side, we have technological innovation and ecological collapse. So at the bottom, it's skeptical, essentially saying that we don't think technological innovation can prevent ecological collapse. Top side is saying that we do believe technological innovation can prevent ecological collapse. Across the top, it's the approach to social, economic, environmental, and political issues. Right side is segmented, thinking about those things individually or only in relation to technology. And then on the left side, it's considering those things holistically. I've summarized very briefly the assumptions associated with each one. So starting with technocentric, people who fall into that category believe that capitalism is compatible with sustainability and technological innovation will lead to decoupling. And decoupling is a word that's often associated with a technological view of the circular economy. And it's essentially saying that we can separate economic progress or economic growth or economic activity from the consumption of finite resources. The reformists moving to the left, they still rely on technology, but they believe that a reformed version of capitalism is needed to achieve sustainability and human success. Moving down, transformational believes that capitalism is incompatible with sustainability. Socio-technical innovation cannot prevent ecological collapse. In a few words, broad system change and broad behavior change is needed, and a shift away from reliance on technology. And the final one is fortress, which believes there is no alternative to capitalism and socio-technical innovation cannot prevent ecological collapse. This one also calls for imposed frugality, strong limits on resource use, and even limits on migration and other human actions in order to combat climate change. So within this, I have two main hypotheses. The first one is that the technocratic solution is dominant. I believe, based on reading different policy documents and different publications from the government of Canada, it appears that discourse and policy around a plastic circular economy in Canada are technocentric and highly optimistic about future technological development. And my second hypothesis is that as a result of the first, alternative actions related to or opposing technocratic circular economy will not be taken, even though we have the ability to undertake them now. And some of those alternatives include things like bans, for example, the ban on 6 single-use plastics in Canada, albeit that's a quite small use of bans. Reuse, ideally non-plastic reuse. So for example, there are companies in Vancouver who are creating metal takeout containers that are in reuse loops. You pay either a membership or a small deposit, and then those containers get used hundreds of times. And then recycling metal is far more efficient than plastic. And then the idea of essential use, this is far more popular in Europe, but the idea is that plastic would only be used for things in which they are 100% essential. There's no alternative and they're a net benefit to society. At this point, I also want to mention just the waste hierarchy and how those technocratic and non-technocratic fit in. So technocratic tends to focus on the bottom, typically looking at recycling. There's occasionally technocratic solutions that deal with reuse, some of the reverse logistics loops, as in getting products back from consumers. The non-technocratic tend to focus on the top of the hierarchy. And as we've all been taught since we've probably started recycling, those are the most desirable. They focus on things like refuse and reduce. So why even conduct this study? My rationale for conducting it is that I want to contribute to making plastics management in Canada safer and more efficient. And my particular audience for this are policymakers, industry, and businesses that are related to a circular economy for plastics and/or alternatives to plastics. And what I hope to contribute is to show what conceptualization of a circular economy for plastics is dominant and what may be overlooked if in plastic management as a result of that dominant discourse. And I also want to discuss trade-offs for future plastic management in Canada. In order to do so, I'm using semi-structured interviews. They're conducted with people in Canada at the municipal, provincial, and federal level who have expertise related to plastic waste management, specifically those in environmental and health roles. I'm also talking to environmental NGOs such as Greenpeace, David Suzuki Foundation, similar, and industry associations such as the Chemistry Industry Association of Canada. I'm going to use, or I am using, thematic analysis to code the data. And like I mentioned earlier, a combination of inductive and deductive reasoning. I had some preliminary codes from the Callisto et al. Framework, and then I've allowed more to arise as I've conducted my analysis. Some considerations that have arisen for me through this process is that the circular economy for plastics may be a misplaced idea. Any leakage, and by leakage I mean plastic leaving those closed loops, of a forever chemical is problematic. The permanence of plastics and the biological activity is inherently problematic, even if it's a small amount that's leaving the system. Focusing on a circular economy for plastics, especially related to technology, also can be a way of green lighting industry and other businesses to continue using plastics and producing plastics when we have the opportunity already to reduce and refuse and take other actions. Is a circular economy for plastics just delaying proper actions that could be taken now? And then there are environmental externalities and human health risks associated with that delay. And then in general, when I came in, I was far more pro circular economy, and now I see it as we need to shift to reduction and then essential use and considering potentially circular loops for those essential plastics. I'm going to share now some preliminary findings, the first of which is the nuance amongst and within participants, and the second is the perceptions of government by NGOs and how those differ from the actual responses, but are consistent with the actual actions. I'm going to move quickly here because I'm running low. The first is that there's nuance amongst participants. So the technocratic framing does not dominate the responses from government as I thought it would. Most participants hold varied opinions that make it really difficult to fit them into a single quadrant on that typology. Overall, I'm seeking more participants to try to provide a richer data set and see how this plays out. So far, this is my preliminary interpretation of where participants fit in. Industry was very simple to fit into technocratic. They spoke at length about recycling, the need for advanced chemical recycling, and the need for investment in both of those things and economic incentives. In the reformist category, that one was very difficult because some people had spoke extensively about chemical recycling, and then later in the interview talked about how we need to reduce plastic use and move away from consumption. And then in transformational, there was a government respondent, which really surprised me. They talked at length about degrowth and shifting away from a purely capitalist model. And then an NGO respondent, which honestly didn't surprise me all that much. Fortress is empty, and that was not surprising because the imposed frugality that's associated with that quadrant is pretty pessimistic, and I did not expect anyone to actually share that type of view with me in an interview when I just met them. With all this said, it's interesting to note the shift from technocratic solutions to more reformist transformational in response to different prompts from the same people in the same interview. And this is one example. This is from a municipal respondent. In response to the question, what are the solutions to the plastics problem? They responded, collaboration is important. National level action is important. New technologies around better options for recycling are all important. And this was after about a 3-minute response where they talked at length about chemical recycling and some advances in recycling that had happened locally by 2 companies over the last 15 years who they are very proud of. To me, this fit very strongly into the technocratic because of the focus on technology and maintaining current business practices. But then in the same interview, in response to the question, is there anything missing from the circular economy idea? This is my last question, and we'd already talked about circular economy for a few minutes. They responded, the big thing is consumption. Like, that is the universal issue. That is the #1 thing. And so it's like, how do we get to reducing consumption? And to me, that really showed more transformational. They're really questioning productivist norms of, producing, using, consuming plastics. Very interesting. The second main finding, and I'm going to go through this one real fast, is that the perceptions of government from ENGOs were very critical, but the response from government didn't seem to fit into that in terms of the responses, but the actual policy seems to. The first response from ENGOs was that governments haven't really been strong in their commitments. They've been really focused at the bottom, at the end of stream, on recycling, on alternate, like new forms of recycling, so-called advanced recycling. And what the Canadian government, and most global governments haven't done is say, actually, we need to cut the overall production of plastic in line with cutting our reliance on fossil fuels. But what I heard from one federal government employee was that people still don't understand that recycling is the least preferable option, that it is the last resort in a circular economy. It's still sort of the go-to technical solution that we have. And so the mainstream sort of thinking is, oh, we'll just recycle more. We need recycling infrastructure. We need this, we did that. But it goes back to the hierarchy, like how do we promote a culture where reuse is actually part of everyday life? And that those kinds of systems work in our convenience, maybe not as convenient, but convenient enough that there's uptake in use. To me, this really contrasted with what the environmental, the ENGO thought of government responses, or the government in general. So the direction of the government appears to be different from the preferred actions of respondents. As I mentioned earlier, the plans around addressing plastic waste are very focused on the circular economy, but this respondent's answer, while mentioning the circular economy, was really focused on a different economic paradigm. They spoke at length in that same interview about degrowth and donut economics and moving away from a purely capitalist paradigm. And while this may seem obvious, it was interesting for me to see it in action that individuals are part of large institutions, but they may not hold opinions that match the direction of that institution. With all this said, I am recruiting more participants and further analyses will be conducted. This data is based on 8 interviews, and I'm hoping to have around 15 when it's all said and done. And with that, I'd like to thank my supervisor, Dr. Gunilla Ober, my committee members, Dr. Naoko Ellis and Dr. Werner Antweiler, participants in my study, the Agesta Lab for some great feedback on this first draft, the entire IRES department for continued support, and support from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. Thank you. Any questions? So the question is, acknowledging that respondents' answers fit into different categories, how will I categorize the respondents, or will I change the framework? Essentially, what I've come to is that I need to categorize the arguments, not the people, and see how that fits in. I'm open, very open to changing this framework as needed. That's one of the benefits of using inductive and deductive, is that if it all fits, great. And if it doesn't, then I'll adapt. I think the main focus, though, is on coding the arguments and seeing which arguments are most present, and then seeing if specific people hold more of certain arguments than others, and go from there. Thanks. Yeah, the question for Zoom is, would it be good to conduct a document analysis to get at the actual direction of government rather than just focusing on the responses of individuals? I think that's a good point. I will certainly consider that. Part of it is just time, being a master's student and just trying to get through it on time, which is rare in our department. That plan, the National Zero Plastic Waste Agenda, will certainly be a big part of it. It's about a 40-page document. Whether or not it'll be a formal document analysis is a good point, but I would say unsure at this point. Okay. The question for Zoom is, do my questions discuss who's responsible for the actual recycling, regardless of what technology is being used? My questions are very broad, and the way that I've laid out my interview guide with a lot of help from Gunilla is to start broad and then get more specific to circular economy because I don't want to tip people off that that's where we're headed. With that said, most people, especially those who are focused on technology, have spoken on their own about who should be responsible for the recycling. In Canada, we have a fragmented system right now. Municipalities are responsible for recycling, the actual collection and sorting and processing. Provinces create policies, and the federal government, to an extent, creates broad policies and controls what comes into the economy. Industry is very supportive of EPR programs, extended producer responsibility, which is essentially industry. There's different ways to create these programs, but the main way is that industry groups pay a certain amount based on the amount that so for plastics, the amount of plastic they put into the economy, they'll pay a certain amount into a fund, and that fund is used for recycling. Right now, in a lot of jurisdictions where they're used, they're partial. So the municipality plays a part and they control the structure, and then industry pays the rest and they don't have control. And it seems like neither side loves that industry wants more control and they're willing to pay more as a result. And municipalities say, we're not getting enough money to do this properly, so we're not going to do it beyond what we're already doing. So yes, it is coming up quite a bit. You also in general see those who are focused more on system change take the onus off of consumers and say we need industry, businesses, and government to change. And those who are focused on technology, I wouldn't say they're focused on the role of the consumer, but they are quick to mention that consumers are asking for plastics, consumers are consuming this plastic, and consumers need to get better at sorting this plastic. Jade?
Actually, I think to the previous two questions, I was wondering, and also you're identifying the discrepancy or like the separation between those who identify individual change versus system change as like the two sides of a coin, kind of. Where do you think that one quote where the person or like that one individual you're interacting with final comment was then like the biggest thing is consumption, but previously that other things are also like valuable, but then like do you think their claim here is therefore that it's on individual, or because like this was a federal government employee, and so
just to clarify this quote here.
Yeah, so like where do you think I don't know, just like from this person's variety of responses, do you think they are inclining towards saying that it's an individual's responsibility, or that they would also, like I'm just thinking of their position as a federal employee, like, what do you take is the thing that was?
Yeah, so the question is that based on this response that's on Zoom right now, the first part of their response was very recycling and technology focused, and the second part was very system change, reducing consumption focused, and how would I categorize them as leaning towards technology or leaning towards consumption. They're a municipal employee, not a federal employee, which I don't know if that changes thinking about it. So where I put them was in reformist, which is essentially saying capitalism isn't perfect, it needs to change, but technology is still useful in terms of solving this problem, and it could be like the key to solving the problem. I still think that they lean towards, I don't think that they're against technology, and I don't think they're heavily for refuse, reduction, and reuse systems. But I also think that they're somewhat constrained by where they are on that pecking order of plastic management. Because they're municipal, they're responsible for collecting the waste that's already in the system. They have a lot less sway over what comes into the economy and the type of broad systems that can be changed. Not to say they don't have any influence, but I think that they may be more focused on what they can control in their day-to-day operations. Okay. No time left. Okay, thank you.